So we've been going through First Peter, and the instructions that he's giving were very practical. We've discovered that as we've gone through this, and we come to First Peter 2:13. The last we saw that God calls you to live a holy life. He calls you to live a holy life in word and in deed, and both are important, right? He's called us to show forth the praises of him who called us out of darkness into his marvelous light. And the next section is probably a section that maybe some people are not the happiest with in some of what is being taught here, because the next section is about submission. And submission is not a word that everybody likes. I certainly didn't like it, not until I became a believer, and I still have my struggles at times with submitting to the Lord and sometimes to authorities and etc. So we're going to look at some of the calls to submission that are here, and we're going to talk about what submission is and what it isn't, because a lot of people have different ideas about it. So let's read some of the passage here, and then we'll look at it. 1 Peter 2:13. Therefore submit yourselves, and this is as a result of being the call of God to live a holy life. Remember, these were people that were facing persecution and trials, so it wasn't like easy street for them. They were going through deep troubles. Therefore submit yourselves to every ordinance or law of man for the Lord's sake, whether to the king as supreme or to governors, as to those who are sent by him for the punishment of evildoers and for the praise of those who do good. So basically, he's saying, if you're going to walk with God, if you're going to submit to the Lord, then you need to be honorable and submit to the government. Now, why would God say that? I mean, what would it matter if you weren't submissive to the government? You're serving the Lord. Why should I do what the government tells me to do? If there's ever a time when it feels like you should tell the government to fly a kite, it's certainly in these days, is it not? I mean, I think rank and file right across Canada and in many other places, it just feels like enough is enough. I mean, robbing you blind. There's all kinds of reasons why you should say, out with the government. So why would he tell us this? And why would he tell it to them? I mean, this was a Roman government, and some of them, of course, they were trying to kill Christians. It wasn't an easy time. And he tells them to submit to the rulers of the day. So, tell me.
He's the one that put them in there?
What's that?
He's the one that places the people in the government?
God permits there to be rulers and governments, and sometimes he actually permits not good government. And sometimes there's a reason behind it, but a lot of times we don't know what the reason is at the time. We can't understand, why is God allowing this person to be in power, or this person to do this or to do that? But God always has a purpose. You see, God's aim is not so that everybody here just carries on and has a pretty good, everything is good. That's not his aim. Because if you live through this life and you get along pretty good and everything, and then you die and you go to hell, what's the good of that? There's no good in the end at all. Because our lives are just a flash in the pan. The Bible says we're like the flower that today is and tomorrow is thrown away. That's what we're like. So if there's an eternity, if there's no eternity, do whatever you want to do and do it with gusto until you're dead. If there's nothing afterwards, what does it matter, right? You'll still end up being probably miserable for most of the time, because I have discovered that over the years, all the partying that I did and then all the party goers that I have ministered to over the years, it gets old, and it gets old pretty fast. And then once the big hoopla of how much the party is, afterwards it becomes such pain and misery that you're locked in and you can't get out. And so God has a bigger plan. And if we don't see his bigger plan, then there's a lot of things that he might call us to do in this world that doesn't seem to add up. I mean, how can it add up if somebody comes to you and let's say you're a young person and says to you, if you say you believe in Jesus Christ, I'm going to blow your head off. Like, how does that add up? Like, what kind of a life are you going to have if you say yes? And we have that's exactly what happened in Columbine, where a young girl was confronted, and she knew that if she said no, she would have walked out of that place because he let them go, some go. She said, no, I believe in Jesus Christ, and he blew her away. I mean, that looks pointless, it looks fruitless, it looks empty, it doesn't make any sense. And yet, she had a great confidence that she was the Lord's. And she knew the value of eternity as opposed to the value of just a life lived here for a few short hours, really. And who knows? We have no idea. She could have walked out and got hit by a truck if she said no. And there wouldn't have been any other more life than what she had then. We have no idea. And that is why God's calling you and me to trust him with our lives, with our thoughts, with our future, with everything that we have. Even if it means our life is taken, or whatever it could be. Just to trust God. So, the idea of submitting to the government, like I said, it's not a popular one. And frankly, it's not a popular one among a lot of Christians either, especially if it's bad government. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't vote according to your conscience because you live in a country where you can. It doesn't mean that you can't, write letters and protest and do everything that is legal to do. You have a right to picket and protest. And that is not sinful and that is not wrong. But it is when you disobey what the laws of the land are that you get into a problem. And God's saying, don't do this. Submit. That's the word that he gives, submit. And, submission is not something that any of us are very good at doing, but it's what God calls us to do. Now, so if that's the case, it says it's the will of God. Here he gives a reason why. It says, for this is the will of God. That's a pretty good reason to start with. It's what God asks of you. So if you're not going to do what God asks of you, I can tell you this. If you're saying, I'm not going to do what God asks of me in this, I'll probably do what he asks of me here. As soon as you start down that road, you're in rebellion and it's only going to get worse. Your rebellion will grow and you'll find yourself on the outs with God. Is it worth it? I can say it's not. It will not be worth it in the end. If you just put it in this kind of perspective. Here's a God who created everything in the entire universe. A God who knows all of the past, the present, and all of the future. He knows every twist and wind in the road of your life. He knows what your end will be, and he knows when it will be, and he knows how it will be. How reasonable would it be to say, I am going to trust him? I mean, and in another thing, even if you think, Dolly, maybe he's not that fair, whatever, what other choice do you have in reality if he is the master of the universe and he owns everything and all things? So what I'm saying is that it's a logical, reasonable thing to do to submit to God. And if I'm unwilling to submit to the government around me, then I'm unwilling to submit to God, even if I don't like what they're doing. By all means, use every possible legal means to do whatever you can to vote people out of power and vote others into power, do whatever you can. But he says this is the will of God, that by doing good you may put to silence the ignorance of foolish men. Now, this is where I want to qualify this. By doing good, you put to silence the ignorance of foolish men. And so he says, the world is filled with people who don't know what's really going on. and they are living foolishly. And he says they need to see somebody who's living right. They do. And that could be your neighbor, it could be your family member, it could be a friend, whoever it might be. Or it could be people that you don't know at all. They need to see people who are living good. Boy, we need more of that, don't we, in our society, in our world? People who live good. Not people who live evil, but live good. And I can tell you that there's a tremendous war goes on to go to the dark side or to go to the light. And the pull to the dark side is there because it offers you a temporary pleasure. The Bible says the pleasures of sin are for a short period of time, but they bring death. It brings destruction. But there's the pull. And I think all of us have known that pull in our lives from whatever that might be, whatever temptation that's there. And yet how destructive it is. And how often a person's whole life will turn on one bad decision. Is that true? One bad decision and they go in that direction. As I went to visit Scott today, I went to another home because frankly, like I said, it was 25 years, I wasn't quite sure of the right house, but I knew somebody in town that would know, so I went to visit them. I got to the door, and as I opened the door, the lady there, and her husband was there as well, burst into tears, and she says to me, "How did you know?" And I said, "You mean about Scott?" "No, about our situation." I said, "I don't know." Well, she said, "God brought you here." And so I went in and we had a conversation, and her daughter is in an absolute complete mess. Drugs, alcohol, loss of her children, and the possibility was looming upon them that their little grandson that they were caring for was going to be taken by child services. Not an easy situation, right? And again, another divine appointment from God. He had me there at just the time that they needed that. So I'm going to be looking with Heather to seek her out and see if we can minister to her in some way and rescue her from the terrible plight that she is in, which she still wants to stay in right now, and yet it's bringing absolute havoc and destruction in her family. So what you do has a tremendous effect, and decisions that are made have incredible repercussions, because God's will is that there are people in this world that are actually doing good. And while it's true, we can protest against the government and we can speak about how things need to change sometimes, or whatever that might be, may it be the mark of your life, not that, but the mark of your life is that you are someone who does good. Let that be the chief mark of your life. Now, what if the government asks you to do something that's wrong? You're supposed to submit to the government. So, should you submit to the government if the government says for you to do something that you know is morally wrong? What are you going to do with that? See, we're going to be confronted with that more and more as a Christian community in a world that's hostile to the gospel. We're going to be confronted with that. So that if you say, well, no, I don't agree with this, I don't believe that girls are boys and boys are girls, I could end up being charged with hate crime for actually saying what I believe is scientifically true. I could be, right? So if the government says you must say that they are the opposite, then, and I say I will not, am I disobeying the government and therefore disobeying the scripture that I just read? Because he says to submit to the government. What do you think?
God is a higher authority.
Okay, so God is not saying that the government is the ultimate authority. He is the ultimate authority. So here I'm going to take you to a passage here in the book of Acts, and I want you to look at these passages to have an understanding of there are limits to authorities. There are limits to the authorities in the land. The law of the land must be upheld, as long as it does not force the Christian to disobey God's law. Does that make sense?
Yes.
So God's law
Okay.
is higher than man's law. So if God says something and man says something and what man commands you to do is contrary to what God has said, I must obey God.
Yes.
And here we're going to see a couple of examples of it in Acts 4:19 and in Acts 5:29. So in Acts 4:17 it says this. Now here's what happened. Peter and John were preaching the gospel, and actually Peter healed a man right at the temple gate in the book of Acts chapter 4, and people came running and he was preaching, and the leaders arrested them and they wanted them to stop by any means, and they severely threatened them so that it spreads no further among the people. Let us severely threaten them that from now on they speak to no man in this name. So that was the command that was given. And these Pharisees at that time, not only were they religious rulers, but they were also given secular authority over the Jews. They had secular and religious authority, so they had both. And so now we're going to command them to not to speak to anybody in the name of Jesus. And here's the answer. They called them and commanded them not to speak at all nor teach in the name of Jesus. But Peter and John answered and said to them, whether it is right in the sight of God to listen to you more than to God, you can judge that. For we cannot but speak the things which we have seen and heard. So they were submitting to government, but they would stop submitting in an area where the government was telling them to do something that was wrong. And we have every right to do that. We have a moral right to do what is right if the government tells us to do something that is wrong. We must do what is right. Mm-hmm. A little later on in Acts 5:27, all of the apostles were preaching, and they got so angry they threw the whole lot of them in jail. You can read it for yourself in the book of Acts. And what happened was an angel opened up the prison, took them all out of jail. They went out into the public and they began preaching again. And so in the morning, the religious rulers and the secular rulers said, go get those guys, the ones we put in jail. And they went to the jail, and everything was locked up, and the guards were there, and they opened up the jail, and there was nobody there. They said, they're not here. Well, where are they? And then they heard where they were. They were out on the street preaching the same as they were before. So then they brought them, and they set them before the council, and the high priest asked them. I skipped a verse here. You have it there, Nora? Read it for me. 28. Acts 5:28.
Didn't we tell you never again to teach in this man's name? He demanded. Instead, you have filled all Jerusalem with your teaching about Jesus, and you want to make us responsible for that.
It's up there, yeah. I just had it back. Did we not strictly command you, thank you, nor teach in his name, not teach his name, and look, you fill Jerusalem with your doctrine and intend to bring this man's blood on us? Well, was the blood of Jesus on them?
Yes.
Yeah, they were the ones that put him to death. They were the ones that arranged to have him put to death. They're saying, you're gonna get us, we're gonna be blamed for this, for putting him to death. If you keep talking about him, which is actually what they deserved. But Peter and the other apostles, go back to 29, answered and said, we ought to obey God rather than men. So there you have the contrast given, right? So that doesn't mean, when it says to submit in the Bible, it's not a submission that is unqualified. It's a submission under God. He's the ultimate authority. And that is the case for any submission. Because, if you haven't discovered it yet, you will, that life is going to take you down all kinds of places where you have to submit. If you're going to go work for somebody,
Yeah.
are you going to have to submit?
Yeah.
Yeah. If you don't, you're out of a job. Now, maybe not if a wife is working for a husband, you know. But
They're the worst.
it might be sometimes the other way around, right? Well,
The boss
know-
that submits.
you know where you're staying. You know where you're sleeping. So, yeah, not submitting will get you in a lot of trouble in a hurry. I mean, I got in lots of trouble. I was kicked out of school for, I think it was 80 days one year and 90 some the other year because grade 11 and 12, that's what I did. I wasn't submitting to anybody or anything. And eventually it will destroy you. It will, because you're going to end up finding that life is full of times when you have to submit to somebody. But that submission has, as I said, qualifications on it. I do not need to submit to something that's wrong. And on top of that, here's something that I've discovered. There's another verse we'll be looking at in a bit. That what I like to do is to find people to submit to. Now, generally, what we want to do is to find somebody to lord over. And what I mean by that is that humility, meekness is better than pride. Here's what Jesus said. It is the meek who will inherit the earth. You wouldn't think that was the case. You would say the dictators, the proud ones, the strong ones, the powerful ones, they're and it looks like they're inheriting the earth right now, but they're not. The meek will inherit the earth. We don't have to be the ones that we think we're going to defeat everybody. Here's what I find, that if I meet someone, I don't care who they are, and I'm willing to submit to them in the sense that I want to learn from them. I want to discover what they can teach me rather than, okay, I'm going to teach them. I know so much, so I'm going to teach them. I learn far more, and then I'm able to help teach others by submitting to people rather than lording it over them. Because someone who is lording it over others, what is the trademark of them? What is it? What is it that they don't do?
They don't admit their faults.
They don't admit their faults. Something else they don't do.
They don't submit.
Yeah. What else?
Pride.
They're full of pride. They don't
Love.
listen. They don't hear a word. They're too busy thinking about how they can be on top of the heap somehow, and they're not listening. They don't hear. And I assure you, I'm half deaf now. So if I don't hear, it's not because I don't want to, it's because I can't hear so well. But I can tell you that I've been told, especially when I was young, that I was not listening. 1,000 times I was told I wasn't listening. And it was all true, I wasn't. I was refusing to listen because I knew better, So submission is not a bad thing. The other thing about submission to think about is this. We think that if I submit to someone, that means they're better than me. Is that often the way the world thinks about it? Oh yeah, if I submit to somebody, well, you think you're higher than I am because I have to submit to you. Why is it that the people that I hated to see more than anything as a young teenager on the highway was, who do you think it was?
The police.
The police. Yeah. I still, when I meet a policeman, even if I'm doing everything just right, automatically something happens inside. After all these years. And, but I have nothing but tremendous respect for those who do. I mean, it doesn't mean that there aren't bad cops. There are, but yeah, this unwillingness to submit because somebody is in a higher position than I am, well, guess what? Get used to it, right? You go to work, you got a boss, and that boss has another boss. Everybody ends up submitting. If you go to school, you have a teacher, right? It's the whole system will fall apart if there isn't any degree of submission. The problem is that people think that if you've got a job bigger than me or higher than me, then you think you're more important, and we hate authority. A hatred to authority is not far away from most people in our world. You just, and this is, I've heard people say this, you know, I worked with all my buddies and we all got along, we were the best of friends, but then I got a promotion and I got the white hat. And suddenly, even though we were friends before, now I was the enemy. Now everybody ate lunch over there. But once they ate with me, now they ate over there. And I was alienated from them. Why? Because I have an authority. And that is ingrained in the rebellion that started at the very beginning of time, when God, in his ultimate authority, instructed mankind and said, don't take of this tree. And the devil came along, who rebelled against God and said, no, take this, go ahead. And so the seed of rebellion against authority was planted by the devil in the human heart, and it has flourished down through the centuries. So we are being instructed, there's another way to live. Get that out of your mind, that because someone has authority over you, they're evil. But it is ingrained in us, and the more rebellious we have been, the harder it is for us to shake that, to get rid of that concept and realize positions and callings do not make a person have more authority, more importance, or that they're more special, or whatever it is. It's just not the case. We'll look at that a little further, because I'm going to probably step on some toes if I have time tonight. I'm pretty well out. We're going to have to do this in sections here. So, as free, but do not use your freedom as a cloak for vice, but as bondservants of God. So, as he speaks of going back to this authority that he has given to us, that we're to submit to authority. Yes, we're free, but we're not free to use freedom as an excuse to do wrong. But let's enjoy the freedom that God has given us to be the bondservants of God. Now, the word bondservant, the literal translation from the Greek is this: a love slave to God. Now, get the love slave, from the bad connotation out of your mind, okay? It's not what it's talking about. It's saying, I'm gladly the slave of Jesus Christ. I'm gladly the servant of Christ. And so he said, you're free, but that freedom is not given to you so that you can do wrong, but to do right. Does that make sense? Yeah. Honor all people. Honor all people. Love the brotherhood. And that is not talking about just men. That's talking about the Christian family. Fear God, respect him, honor the king, whoever is in authority. So this is the first submissive act that we are called to, and that is to submit to government, but to do it in such a way that we honor the Lord. And then the next one is he's speaking to servants, being submissive to your masters with all fear. And the word fear here carries with it that honor, that respect that is deserved. Not only to the good and gentle, but also to the harsh. And this is a little difficult at times, and people have misinterpreted this and misunderstood what's being said here. But the idea in this passage and the culture of that day was actually what we will call slavery now, but not the slavery of the Deep South. As a matter of fact, if you happened to be a servant in a Roman household, you were far better off than the free man who walked in the street. The free man on the street was sleeping in the gutter. He had nothing. He had no employment. He had no means of making a living. Most of the time he would spend stealing, doing whatever he could to get by. The man who became a servant or indentured, it was more of an indenture. It was like you almost sell your life to the master, and as a result of that, he's obligated to look after you, he's obligated to feed you, he's obligated to feed your family. All of those things were part of it. So when you see servant and master, often it really was employer and employee in our terms today. And so he encourages them to submit to, again, there's authority in the workplace. I already really touched on that, didn't I? Because we should do that. And even if they're not, good bosses. Now, in our culture today, we can decide, I'm quitting. So, and you have every right to do that. It doesn't mean you have to stay with that job. Sometimes it's pretty good to make sure you got another one before you get rid of the one you got, even if it's as bad as it might be. For this is commendable if because of conscience toward God one endures grief and suffers wrongfully. He says God commends this is because of conscience toward God. In other words, because you're going to do the right thing, you will endure grief even if people are doing wrong to you, which they shouldn't do. He says God will look after you. I can assure you God will look after you. Through the years, I have had an opportunity to work for different people after I was a Christian, and it was amazing how God honored that, because they knew they could trust me with whatever they had and whatever needed to be done, that I would do it, and I would do it well. They knew that I wouldn't be out to pilfer or to gyp or anything like that. They knew that they could leave everything with me. That wasn't the case before. I can tell you that very clearly. Before I was saved, it just wasn't good. I remember one time I was up in Inuvik in the Northwest Territories, way out there, and we ended up, a friend of mine wanted a generator, and so he said, I'm going to go and, he had worked for a guy, said, I need a generator, you want to come with me and we'll steal his generator because I want a generator. So I said, yeah, sure, I don't care. So we get in it was a native guy, had a car. There wasn't very many cars there because there was no highway in or out of there. But he had this old bucket of a car, and we said we're going to go steal his generator. So we get in the car, we go out of town, and we're out in the bush there, and the gate was locked. So we had to drag the generator through the woods. And so we dragged this generator, and it was like, how some generators are. There's a heavy generator, right? So we drag it all the way through the woods. We shove it in the back of the car. And in the meantime, forgot to mention that, I was looking for work. And so I ended up working for this guy. And of course, I was the long-haired hippie and the rough guy, right? And so the boss, the guy that I worked for, he was like, you probably would call him a classic redneck, right? And so he only had about 4 or 5 days work for me. But one thing I always did was work and work well. So I did a great job. I did whatever he told me to do. And after 4 or 5 days, he said to me, I got to tell you, he said, when I saw you coming here, because he had put it through manpower, right? And he didn't know what he was getting. When I saw you coming in here, I said, not another hippie. He said, I can't stand hippies, he said. But he said, you know what? He said, you're the first hippie I can say, yep, you did a good job. And he said, you can come back and work here anytime. So about 2 days later, I'm in the woods stealing his generator. So we drag the generator to the woods, we shove it in the back of the car, and we have a driver. So, and the trouble with the car was as soon as you started it, it took off. There was no neutral. So it started and it drove away. We knew that, but we kind of forgot it, and we hollered at the driver while we were just ready to put the generator in the trunk. Start the car, will you? So then we're running down the road with the generator behind us. We get it in the back of the car and we're on our way. We just get going and lights come on top of the hill a little ways away. Gee, I hope it's not the cops. Yeah. Who else would it be? I don't know. It was not the cops. Sure enough, it was the cops. They were on the hill and they watched the whole thing happen. They watched the whole parade. So down to the jailhouse we go, booked and etc., etc. Anyway, the guy that wanted to steal the generator, up there north, you could get away with quite a bit of stuff. He took the rap for it, so I didn't end up getting a record, which was a blessing because it would have certainly hindered a lot of the ministry that I've done in a lot of places. But anyway,
You probably didn't get a job. You probably didn't get the job.
Well, I happened to be in the coffee house maybe 2 or 3 weeks later, and who came in but this guy. And when he saw me, he turned red. And he came roaring over, and he said, "Forget what I said about hippies." He said, "Every one of you, there's not one." He was wild. But I couldn't blame him, could I?
No.
But at that time, I really didn't care. But if you do want me to work for you, you can trust me now. I won't steal your generator now. Yeah. But that is what comes with the territory whenever you're in rebellion. You're going to go down every crazy path. You do. And it gets worse. It doesn't get better. It gets worse. This is why I'm saying this idea of submission, whether it's to the government or whether it's in the workplace, wherever it is, do what God says to do. Now in 1 Peter 2:20 it says, "What credit is it if when you are beaten for your faults you take it patiently?" It was the culture of the day. If the slave didn't do what he was supposed to do, there's a good chance he might get beaten. But when you do good and you suffer for this is commendable before God. In other words, do what is right. And if you get persecuted for doing that which is right, then don't worry, God will look after you somehow. He'll do something with that. Do the right thing is basically what is being told here. And then he gives you this example. And the example here, and this is an incredible passage, and it's somewhere we're going to just dwell on this passage and look at the beauty of it. But he's using this, Peter's using this to illustrate, well, is there someone that walked this road before? Is there somebody that walked a submissive road?
Yes.
For to this you were called, because Christ also suffered for us, leaving as an example that you should follow his steps. What were the steps that he took? First, he committed no sin. Well, I suppose none of us can say that. But we're still encouraged to follow in his steps. Nor was deceit found in his mouth, which means he never told a lie. Okay? But he's challenging you and I, don't take the pathway of sin. We have choices. Every day we have choices. Make the wrong choice, there will be results from it. Jesus never sinned. We know that we are not there. But we'd have the promise that if we do sin, we can ask for forgiveness and it's done. And we can move on from there. We don't have to swim in it. And hallelujah, we don't have to swim in our past sin, because if we did, we'd never get out of the guilt and the shame and the mess of it all. But we are free from it when we trust in the Lord. Neither was deceit found in his mouth. He didn't lie. Who, when he was reviled, that means he was hated, despised, and persecuted, he didn't revile in return. He didn't go back at them. My goodness, if he had chosen to, what would have happened?
He would not have died on the cross.
Yes, but what would have happened to the ones if he had chosen to do something against them?
They would have died.
He'd have blown them all away, right? Didn't he say when they came to arrest him, the Roman soldiers came to arrest Jesus, and he said, "You're coming at me with, swords and sticks." He said, "Don't you know that even now I could call on my Father and he would send a legion of angels? A legion of angels. An army of angels would appear." And that is the amazing part of this, that all the while, when he was being persecuted and reviled, he could have done anything to them at any moment. When he suffered, he did not threaten. He didn't come after them. He didn't come off the cross and blow them to pieces or put them all up on crosses and torture them there. He allowed them to do all the worst that they could ever do to him, but he committed himself to him. In other words, he said, I'm going to trust the Father with my life and with my death and with all the suffering that I am going through. And the suffering was unimaginable for us because it was mental, spiritual, physical. We look at the physical, we see that. But what went on inside in the heart of Christ when he cried out, my God, why have you forsaken me? None of us can ever understand. But he still committed himself to him who judges righteously, who himself bore our sins in his own body on the tree, so that we, having died to sins, might live for righteousness, and by whose stripes you were healed. By the wounds of Jesus, he has brought healing into your heart, into your soul, into your life, into your experience. Jesus did all of this, but he did it by being submissive. He didn't do it by being authoritative and destroying people. He did it by humbling himself in the pathway of meekness. It is not the world's way. I freely acknowledge that, but it is God's way. The concept of submission is one that we will be continuing to learn, and we will find ourselves at time not. But God brings us back and says, okay, Lord, give me the heart of submission that I need to have. Out of time, because then it says this, for you were like sheep going astray. That's what we were like. But you have returned to the shepherd and overseer of your souls. All of us, like sheep, have gone astray, but you've returned to the Lord. Now, I didn't know if I'd get into the next chapter, but I'm going to just tantalize you with how wonderful it is. Wives, likewise, be submissive to your own husbands. Yeah, I know. It sounds horrible, doesn't it? But we're going to look at the context of this. And we're going to look at the husband's responsibility in this too. And you're going to discover that this is not a dirty word here. Even here, it is not a dirty word. And I'll explain that. But I'm going to have to leave it for next week. And encourage you to read it over and come back. And come back with questions. And challenge me if you think, I'm saying something that I shouldn't say here. I want us to see... when I said this, I said, God is going to be telling you things that the world is going to shout at you and say, no, that's wicked. That's not right. That's not fair. But remember one thing, right? The husband is no better than the wife. Definitely not. Matter of fact, in my relationship, the wife is better than the husband. So it has nothing to do with who is better than who. And it doesn't mean that, that means the husband just, can lord it over his wife. It certainly doesn't mean that. I'm starting to go into it already. I can't help it. But, we will go through this and we'll look at a passage in Ephesians that talks about submission and see, there's a balance here, a beautiful thing that can happen in a husband and wife relationship that has nothing to do with a husband bossing his wife around. That isn't what this is teaching at all. If that's what a man thinks, then the man is so wrong and so far away from what the Bible actually teaches. Just a spoiler, and it's this. A man is to love his wife so much that he's going to die for her. He's going to do everything he can to serve her. Jesus Christ said he came not to be served, but to serve. And the Bible in Ephesians chapter 5 says, a man is to love his wife as much as Christ loved the church. So, if you can find a husband who is willing to serve you with his whole life to the point where he'll die for you, when he asks you to do something, you're going to say, no problem, dear. Glad to do it for you. I assure you. That's a little hint of how God is meant for things to be between a husband and wife. Not a war, not a battle, not a lording it over. None of those things. That's not the way God's plan is. It's so sweet and so beautiful. But listen to this, and I'm gonna jump ahead a little bit. Just keep going there until I was just going to give you one verse, Ephesians 5:21. So just keep going ahead, because we're going to look at the rest of this, because there. Here's God's call for all of you, for me too. Submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. Submit to one another. So if I'm the pastor in the church, then it's not my position to lord it over you at all. I'm called to serve you. I'm called to come underneath you and see if I can lift you up as high as I can in my life. And sadly, that's not always the case in churches. Preachers, pastors, they get swelled heads. I hope mine just becomes a pinhead. But that is the call of God. So what I said earlier, I meant it when I say I look for people to submit to. And I look for opportunity to learn from you, to hear from you. And hopefully I can stay in that place and grow in that place of humility. Because that's God's call in my life. So we'll go to part 2 next week. And my challenge to every one of us is have a submissive spirit, not a rebellious spirit. Most of us have had a rebellious spirit long enough. Now let's look for a submissive one by the grace of God. By the grace of God, because it's not normal, not in this world, to have a heart that is full of humility and meekness and looking for that opportunity to say, okay, the ground is level in the respect as far as God's relationship to us and our relationship to each other. It's level ground, but I recognize authorities and I recognize the opportunity, not the curse, but the opportunity to submit and discover the blessings that God pours in your life. I would sooner have the Spirit of God upon me so that I can be filled with love and joy and peace and serving people and loving people than have a kingdom. What would it matter, right? Than to lord it over people, than to think I'm better than others and get puffed up and all the ugliness of what pride does in your life. It just rips you and it diminishes everybody else around you, demeans other people. And the other way around, it exalts other people. It lifts other people up. And we live in a world where most people are being trampled. They're being trampled on by others. And when you begin to pour out and to love and to serve other people, I'll tell you, they appreciate it because they don't get too much of it. I think I'm right in that. They really don't. After all that, any thoughts or comments?
Submission, it's closely related to obedience.
It is, only it can be in the area of obedience, but it's also in an area of a willing heart. It's not just the obedience, but it's the heart. Remember, man looks on the outward appearance. God looks on the heart. I mean, you can be told to do something, and you might do it, but in the meantime, on the inside, I wish I could give that guy a poke, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's heart. It's always the heart, isn't it? The Lord. But you have the best example in Jesus, right? Mm-hmm. You couldn't find any greater example. That's why Peter used it that way. Anybody else?
When I think of submission, I think of it's always an opportunity to learn something from someone else,
Absolutely.
anybody. And yet, on the other hand, it's humbling, and that's where pride comes in.
Yes.
Because it's not always easy to admit that you can learn from everybody.
Mm-hmm.
It's like they're
true.
polar opposites in some
Yeah.
way. And I learned that from you a long time ago.
I think I've said this before, but I have found parents who have sometimes very, I don't know what the word used today, ability, disability child, who love that child and care for that child so deeply. In one sense, they are submitting their lives to the care of a child who cannot do anything, but they're coming under this child and they're serving them. They're the sweetest people I've ever met. There's a depth of love and care, and it's that meek, humble spirit that's there where they're willing to do that. I've always been so deeply touched and affected. And actually, I think I can learn more from somebody like that than I could from any professor in any university. Far more. Because the things that really matter really are your character, aren't they? Not how much knowledge you can stuff between your ears.